And then when you had 5 hours of teaching instrument flying on it, you were narrated on tape and you could do anything you wanted. So it was a good, I enjoyed it anyway, it was a good system. But that's enough about me. Air Atlantique, I should just mention, I left CSE with the grand plan of spending a year with Air Atlantique. I'd always wanted to fly a DAC. Couldn't tell you why, it was just one of those things that caught my imagination. And after a year of doing that, I was going to go and get a proper job. 30 years later, I was still looking for the proper job. I thought, why leave this when you're having so much fun? So every year when the time came to make the decision, it was, nah, they might have an oil spill and I'll miss it. You know, and I'll be so cross if that happened. For anyone who doesn't know what a DC3 looks like, again, it's a C47. Hard to spot the differences from the DC3, but I'll point out one or two as we go along. That's one of the Atlantic sprayers, and it's been modified, excuse me, to carry dispersant for spraying oil spills, and we had a fair fleet of them doing just that. The main reason so many DC3s are kicking around nowadays, and I'll call it a DC3 from here on in just to save the words, is that there's no main spar. Just have a look at that wing. It's got 3 little spars, but no one load-bearing spar. When fatigue testing came about following the Comet accidents, they went and checked all existing aircraft and put them through fatigue testing. And most of them came out with a life of 20,000, 30,000 hours, something like that. They gave up testing on the DAC at 100 years. And just said, tell you what, let's just call it on life, shall we? So it's one of very, very few aeroplanes that can still be around so many years later because it hasn't got a life wing. The design was such, find the little button, that there's a better picture of it that I'll show you later. But the wing just bolts on. It's as simple as that. There are 364 bolts running across there. So if that wing gets damaged and we need to change it, we just take it off and put another one on. There was a famous example where the DC2 is a little bit smaller than the DC3. It looks virtually identical, but it is just a little bit smaller all round. And there was an uprising in China around about the time that people needed to get out of there in a hurry. And they had a serviceable DC3 with a damaged wing. They had a DC2 that wouldn't fly, but had a good wing. They took the DC2 wing and put it on the DC3. The one and only flight of the DC2.5. But it flew perfectly successfully, and they got out of China when they needed to. So it's quite a remarkable design in so many ways. The thing that makes it the C47 rather than the DC3 is largely that door. That's the single biggest difference that you'll notice from the outside anyway. That's the rear half of the cargo door. It was much again on the forward end. The biggest single piece that we could fit into there was a Spey engine. As long as the Spey didn't have its afterburner on it, we could get it into a DAC. But it was a work of art getting it in. It involved the Spey sitting on its engine stand, supported by an A-beam just dangling from the top. 2 bottle jacks on the frame. We had to lift the 2 bottle jacks together and take the weight of it so that we could take the A-frame off. And this is, you know, several, probably $1 million worth of engine is now being pivoted on 2 bottle jacks. We'd then take a forklift truck with a very long tine and come at it from as close to the tail as we could get and feed it at an angle through that door. With the A-frame on, it was too high to get through the door. A-frame off, we can get it in. We'd then connect the winch to it, take the strain pointing up the hill a little bit, reposition the forklift to the side and give it a little nudge sideways, and then really quickly put the A-frame back on again before we did anything expensive. Took several hours, but you could do it. We'd then winch it up the hill to about 2/3 chord, where the main spar would have been, is a centre of gravity point. So you can't just stick it in the back door and leave it there. You have to get it up the hill to keep the aircraft in balance. All of which always worked absolutely fine when we were loading it. When it came to unloading it, it was usually in Spain, and they usually didn't speak English, and neither do I, from Yorkshire, so when it came to speaking Spanish, that was a step too far. And they would always begin the conversation with, "It doesn't fit the door." Well, we got it in, you know, we got it in, we can get it out. But it was several hours worth of work loading a spay, and then we'd set off. And typically we were following back 111s around the place. They would go tech in the nicest of places. So BIA is one of my favourite airlines to this day, purely because when they went tech, we'd fly down to Exeter, we'd pick up 5 engineers, their toolkits, we'd then hop on, usually to Lasham, somewhere like that, pick up the engine, and then take the whole shebang down into Spain, somewhere on the south coast, somewhere hot and sunny and nice. We couldn't do it in one hit, so there's a nice little tech stop in France on the way there. Usually ran the Bowser out of fuel, so it took several hours rather than a quick turnaround. And then off we'd go again. We would then have to wait there until they'd taken the Duff engine off the back 111, because they might need to rob some bits off it. So we had nothing to do but have a nice time, flying around Italy, Spain, all sorts of places. Ergonomics. You think of the design of a modern aeroplane, and a lot of attention is paid to making switches look different from each other, so that we're not going to get them confused. Well, they hadn't heard of that in the DAC, so all the switches look like that. The ones on the bottom row are not totally significant. There are various lights. There's a different one here. Prop de-icer was a fluid, so that's actually just turning on an electric motor that pumps de-icing fluid into a slinger ring and then over the props. So that flow rate for that has to be set before you start the engines, because you can't hear it, and it's all done by sound. So part of the pre-flight check, turn the prop de-ice on and listen. Little rear stat on the side of the tank where the controls the motor. Okay, that's the lowest setting. With the lowest setting, I've got about 4 hours of de-icing fluid. So now everything's set. Don't touch it, and it's going to be good for the flight. Windshield de-ice again is a fluid, just a spray ring on the windshield. That came into its own when we were spraying an oil spill at the Bray up in Shetland. The weather was pretty foul. I'll show you the film a bit later. But the oil was blowing over the land. It was in the spray from the sea, and we're flying in the spray from the sea. So we're getting covered in oil as we're flying along, and that's not just our own, that's stuff coming at us from the sea. So someone had the bright idea, let's put some ferroliquid in the windshield tank. And we managed to keep the windshield clear so we could see where we were going while we were spraying, which worked pretty well. Up on the top, fire extinguisher, 1 shot per side. And perhaps one of the most important switches in the aeroplane is that one, and its equivalent on the right-hand side, and that's the feathering button. In the event of an engine failing, we've got to feather the propeller. We do not have enough power or rudder authority to control the aeroplane if we don't get the propeller feathered and expect level flight. With it feathered, it'll do anything you ask of it. With it not feathered, it won't. Gauges again, just to give you an idea of what's where. We had a standard fleet at Air Atlantique in terms of the layout of gauges and controls, right up to the point where we got the second aeroplane. And then after that, it's whichever airline had the aircraft ahead of us decided on a plan and then found a gap that they could put something else in. If I tell you that the transponder was behind the co-pilot's seat, mounted this way, so it could only be set by the captain sort of doing that and having a twiddle. On the early ones, we did improve on that by taking the autopilot out, but that's another story. The gauges themselves are really well designed. You've got two needles on the same gauge, so left engine, right engine, transposed. So if all is well with your world, you just see the one needle. The time to worry is when you see that. And 9 times out of 10 you'll look and you think, that one's low. Actually, it might be that one that's high. You do have to stop and read it. Mr. Douglas was not big on colour coding. So, again, modern aircraft, you'd expect it to keep it in the green arc. If it's in the green arc, it's going to be all right, isn't it? No, we don't do green arcs. You have to learn the numbers, and the numbers have to be correct. So, notice the size of the oil pressure gauge. Yeah, it's not a piddly little thing that we would see on most modern aeroplanes. It's a really good, decent thing, and it never lied. Never. If that one, it's an open pipe to the engine as far as I'm concerned. If that started working its way down, making a beeline for the nearest airport and getting ready to shut it down. If you wait for the temperature to come up as well, which is the traditional thing, isn't it? Oil pressure's low, let's look for the high temperature. Bit of a problem with the DAC because it's got a self-regulating thermostat on the oil temperature. It will hold 68 degrees as long as it humanly can, and then it'll go all at once. So you might look and think, well, the temperature's not changing. That's because the oil cooler is busy opening itself fully up. Yeah? So believe the oil pressure gauge because it does not tell porkies. One thing that is perhaps slightly unusual as a layout is the carburetor temperature gauge. So these engines can suffer from carb icing just like a Cherokee or a Cessna 150 will. The difference is that the throat to the carburetor on the DAC is about that big. So if the carb ice to actually make any real impact, you're having a really bad day. They still take it seriously and guard against it. And we have two means of clearing carb ice. Just on the right here are the carburetor heat controls. Again, just like a Cherokee, put the heat in, give it time to do something, take the heat out. The only symptom I ever saw in 30 odd years was a slight split in manifold pressure. So we always took great care to set the manifold pressures very, very accurately and evenly, because if there's a split, you've got carb ice, and we would put the heating on and get rid of it. They then thought, well, that's fine, but if you've got carb heat applied, you can't have full power because the danger of detonation is too great. We can do a lot of damage putting a hot charge and then asking for full power. So what they did then was put a fluid de-icing system in as well. So one of those little switches in the roof is the same de-icing fluid, but this time it's pointed straight at your carburetor. I never had to use it, but I can imagine that it was quite handy if you did. I want full power, but I think I'm getting carb ice. You'd use the fluid, not the heat. Anybody read Fate is the Hunter? Mr. Gann had another way of clearing carbides. And it would work. Again, I wouldn't want to try it. But basically what he did was cut the mixture off, let the propeller windmill just for a few seconds. Sorry, I'm telling you wrong. Turn the mags off, let the engine just run down, count to 3, now turn the mags on again, and there'll be the most almighty bang, which will either clear the ice or lose you an exhaust pipe. Probably 50-50, so there was a good reason why I never tried that one. But in fairness, I never needed to either. Lighting in the aeroplane. These are... the lighting's pretty poor, I'll be honest. It was almost like an afterthought. So they've stuck the odd lamp here and there that you can then twizzle round to point it at what you want. One of them's a wander one, so you can unclip it and, you know, wander about with a torch with a big lead on it, sort of thing. But we never ever would go anywhere without a torch being readily to hand, because you did need it. I love this. What other aeroplane can you think of that has a checklist that says turn off fuel, oil, etc.? This was written in the day when they expected pilots to have a bit of nous. Come on, surely you know what to turn off if you've had a fire. Who would not know that? I don't think we'd get away with the same thing nowadays. Mag system. Left and right mags on each engine. That is a mag master switch. I can kill both engines just hitting that one flat. Very handy if you're slithering to a halt off the edge of the runway or something. Which was not an infrequent occurrence, I have to say. Fire detection. We have a warning light on either side. And as you saw, we've got a fire extinguisher so we can deal with it accordingly. Right hand side looks pretty much the same, a few different lights, but otherwise it's as you'd expect. The engines. The original DC3 had Wright cyclones. The DACs that we had at Coventry were all Pratt & Whitney 1830s, which is the cubic capacity in inches. Pratt & Whitney's motto, if you look at the badge on the side of a Pratt & Whitney engined aeroplane, it'll say, the world's most dependable engine. And that's because you can depend on it doing something. One of the things that I notice as a difference between, I won't say my generation because I'm out of kilter with what generation I'm supposed to be in anyway, but people who flew things like DACs, let's put it that way, you were suspicious. Every takeoff brief meant something because you might just need it. And it wasn't a common occurrence, but it wasn't unexpected and it wasn't unusual. Compare that to the modern pilot. They will go through a whole career having never shut an engine down, and that's a good thing. I'm not saying it isn't. But in terms of the mindset that they approach the flight with, getting them to understand that it's not just words on a takeoff brief, you're preparing yourself for what might happen next. And because it's such a rare occurrence, youngsters that I often fly with nowadays will just look at me as if I'm off a different planet. Why would it fail? You know, well, why wouldn't it? And things like that. Pretty sturdy engine. One of the beauties is that there's a very short length of high tension going to the engine. The ignition leads are relatively short for the size of the engine, which means that you're less likely to get mag drops and the like. The only thing this engine really didn't like was rain overnight. we had blanks that we put in front of the cylinders. Excuse me. And that was because if you didn't, you would have a mag drop, guaranteed, the next day. Put the blanks in and should be as good as gold. Puzzled me for quite a long time flying the DAC as to how you bolt two engines together and make them work. Because that's what the 1830 is. It's 2 rows of 7 cylinders each. So 2 Harvard engines clapped together. There's the 1830. The best way to imagine it is that you've got one piston. In this case, that one. That's the master cylinder. It's running onto the crank, and all the others are smaller, and they're just nudging it a bit further. And that's the way it works in my head. I've got one big one doing most of the work, and all the little ones just moving alongside. And once it's running, it's going to look something like that. Now, that's 5 cylinders, we've got 7, but again, you get the idea. A very rugged little engine. You can lose a cylinder and hardly notice it. If we lost a cylinder, we'd made sure it went properly before we got it back to base, because when it cooled down, they wouldn't find it. You crack a cylinder head when the engine's running reasonably hot, you'll get the odd pop and a bang, depending on which cylinder and how big the crack. But you'd get back, you'd tell the engineers, they do the check, and they go, compressions are fine on all of them. So after that, we knew that on the way into base, we'd just let it run hot for a little bit, and then it would really go, so the engineers could find it. Different way of thinking, isn't it? So that was the way of things back then. Engine controls, again, not entirely conventional. For those that fly piston twins, you'd be used to having the throttles here, propeller controls there, and the mixtures here. Well, we've got the propellers here, the throttles in the middle, and the mixtures are automatic. They're a very rugged engine. They will do whatever you ask them to do, provided you ask them nicely. No sudden changes. The bit they really didn't like was the low power. If you end up with the RPM higher than the manifold as a number, then you could hear it start to think, I'm not sure about this. You've got 2 conditions typically on an engine. You've got the engine driving the propeller and it's under load, everything's working as it's supposed to go, and it's as happy as can be doing that. But if I throttle back far enough that I'm now windmilling the propeller is now driving the engine. And actually it's all right doing that as well, because the load is the same way. So it doesn't mind windmilling. The bit it really hates is the bit in the middle. And on the deck, that's 15 inches of manifold. Anything between 12 inches and 15 inches, you can hear it. It's slapping cylinders around, it just rattles, and we don't need to be there. Give it a bit more, let's get out of that. So we had a minimum manifold pressure that we used to set on the approach. The minimum was 15. Normal power on the approach would be 18 inches. RPM, 2050 is a good cruising RPM, and it's a precise number because practically everything else is banned. I can have 2550 RPM, I can have 2350 RPM, or I can have 2050. And I can go a bit lower than that, but it sounds horrible, you wouldn't want to. The reason it's prohibited is that it sets up a harmonic in the airframe, and it damages, I believe it's the rudder post at 1 RPM and something else at another RPM. So all I had to know was these are the RPMs you can have, so I can ignore everything else. Another neat design thing about the DAC is the fuel selector for the left engine, and that's the same thing for the right engine. Now, we could carry 670 imperial gallons of avgas, because you needed a big wallet if it's nowadays prices, wouldn't you? And if you think of the selector as the engine, we have 4 tanks, and we can select either engine to any tank. No restrictions. There is, I think, 2 gallons difference in quantity between the main tank and the auxiliary tank, which is the one that sits behind it. Traditionally, we would take off on the main tanks. We climb to a cruising altitude of 7,000 or 8,000 feet, and then we'd empty the auxiliary tanks. The reason we did it that way around was that the return flow from the carburetor that it didn't need. So imagine there's a demand on the engine, it's producing what's necessary to run the engine at the power you've asked. Everything in excess of that gets fed back into the tank on the same side. So we've got to have room in that tank for that return flow. So we'd run the box tanks, and by running it for typically top of climb, you'd made enough room for the whole of the return fuel if you needed it. The total unusable fuel for the whole aeroplane was 1 gallon. Compare that to an Islander, which I think is 15 or something. It's just ludicrous. But yeah, when you ran them dry, you ran them dry. There was nothing lurking anywhere else. And we would empty the auxiliary tanks. We did it on time. We thought you definitely couldn't rely on the gauges. So we did everything on time. Select the augs, and about a quarter of an hour before you think it's going to run out, you put the fuel pump on, because that will now give you just a little bit more notice. When the fuel pump starts to, fuel pressure starts to do that, straight round to the main, and it's seamless. It picks up. It doesn't even die, to be honest, if you do it that way. If it does die, it'll pick up. There's enough inertia in the props to keep things going. So the system was very, very simple, very straightforward. Did catch a friend of mine out once who was used to fuel selectors looking parallel. You know, I want both on the mains, both on the augs, both off. It's not like that. All the settings are the same on each one. So if I've got the left main, this one's here, and the right one to the right main will be over there somewhere. Yeah? So he looked down and evened them up in the middle of a spray run, which was not a good idea at the time, given that the auxiliaries were empty. So, one of several failures. That gives you a slightly better view of the tanks. Trim wheel for the pitch trim. The aircraft is incredibly stable to fly. So if you trimmed it and let it go, she would not move from that position. She would be happily purring along. Part of the demonstration, I used to teach the spraying, and to convince people that the aeroplane will do most of the work if you don't fight it, was to get down to spray height, which is about 20 feet, sit over the sea, trim it out every which way, and then say, now take your hands and feet off. And we'd sit there for a few minutes and just watch the aeroplane fly perfectly happily in a straight line. So now that's what the aeroplane wants to do. Everything you're going to do to it is going to interfere with that. So leave it alone, it'll be fine, but you must trim. We went away from the argument that you may have read from various books from wartime, that they used to trim the aircraft to fly nose up if they were flying low level in case the pilot got shot. I worked on the principle that nobody was shooting at us, and you're going to tire yourself out if you're doing that all day long. Let the aeroplane fly straight and level and trim. Another clever design feature, you're looking at the elevators there, and you might just be able to spot that there's the trim tab, there's another trim tab, but there's no connection here. That bracket is underneath, because this elevator is this one turned upside down. You only need one spare elevator. Yeah, sure they tried to do it on the rudder as well, so that they could get away with using the same thing, but unfortunately it wasn't big enough. You've got a pretty big rudder, and that's for a really good reason. Lose an engine at high power, and you're pushing pretty hard to get to keep the ball in the middle. Doable, I can do it. I'm not exactly a necklace, but you've got to have your seat in the right place. In my case, I've got to have a cushion behind me, and I never went anywhere without my cushion, so that I could control whatever came next. Rocket Alpha, my favourite. She was a good 10 knots faster than any other deck we had, and nobody knows why. She just flew better. No other reason. One of the saddest things I ever did, I delivered her to Berlin, where a company over there had bought her to do pleasure flying around Berlin. You know, history of the airlift, all that sort of stuff. And I pleaded with my boss, don't sell them it. They crashed the last one. Don't give them another. And he was retiring, everything was coming to an end. He said, "Can I got to?" I said, "Well, I'm not taking her. I can't start giving away your favourite puppy. I'm not doing it. Send somebody else." "No, there's nobody else." You know, the usual sort of thing. I said, "All right, I'll do it on one condition, and that is that I do not have to talk to anybody at the other end, because I'll end up saying something while holding her head." Yeah. And we'll send John with you. He'll talk to the press. That's fine. So I flew it over there. I chose the route. So we did Arnhem, the Berlin corridor from Braunschweig. But at least she can have a good run with a bit of history behind her. A route she'd flown before. We got to the other end and they made a lovely fuss of the airplane. They were very excited to get the DAC. It means an awful lot to people in Berlin, and I can understand that. Unfortunately, before I could get off the aeroplane, a furry microphone was shoved under my nose with a reporter going, "Do you have a message for the German people?" Yes. "Don't crash this one." Crinkly smile. The ambassador was not happy, apparently. I did warn them. What can I say? She never flew again. She never flew again. The German authority put so many obstacles in the way. Floor level lighting, escape slides, you name it, they wanted all sorts of stuff. But she's in a museum somewhere in Germany now. Heartbreaking. Another clever thing about the design of the DAC is the hydraulic system. Now, everything that can be hydraulic is. Even the windscreen wipers are hydraulic. You expect gear and flaps, but windscreen wipers? They are. And it's a very, very simple system. This is just behind the co-pilot seat. There's a reservoir, there's the accumulator, lots of pipes going everywhere. That sight gauge is visible from the cockpit. That's euphemistically called the hydraulic panel. Right? So you think, okay, the tank is what you're looking at there. That's the main shut-off for it, and then we have a flap selector, we have a gear selector, and in the floor we have a hand pump for it. So you've got an emergency backup. We've got an engine-driven pump, one on each engine. Either one on its own can run anything, but it does it at half the speed. And there's no real prioritising of systems, so one of its little quirks was you're coming in on short final. You think, I'll have full flap about now, because we use the flaps to slow down to threshold speed. And it's perhaps raining, so you've got the windscreen wipers merrily doing their thing. And the moment you select the flap, the windscreen wipers stop, because everything goes to the flap, and you're wondering where the world has gone, hoping it will reappear before you have to do something about it. But once you know that's going to happen, then you can plan accordingly. Not a terribly good picture, sorry about that, but those really large gauges there are for the hydraulic system. The front one is the pressure in the gear down line. So if I have pressure in the gear down line, the gear is down. Pure and simple. If I have no pressure in that line, the gear is up. Now we have other indications and locks as well, but that's the primary one. At the back is the main system pressure. So selecting the gear down, it's not a neat little switch like you might expect in a modern aeroplane. It's a lever by the co-pilot side. So they'll select the flat, I said gear, didn't I? Put the gear lever fully down, and then watch these two gauges. And what I'm expecting to happen is that the front one will be 0, the rear one will drop towards 0, and then they'll both build up. And when they both build up and go ka-choom, your gear's down. Now I'll go about locking it. So now I have a little latch in the floor that I'll put underneath another latch, and that's now locked, and it's down. I still don't have any warning lights telling me anything. I'll bring that selector that I used to put the gear down back to the middle. That makes a micro switch, and micro switches in DAC terms, it's about that big. Okay, there's nothing micro about it. But only when I've made that final switch will I get the green light. Now you can wind up air traffic a treat, because of course you'll get 2 green lights, and that really upsets them. I'm fine with 2 greens. Or if you really want to do it, you've actually only got 1 green, the other one is a spare bulb. So if either green light is on, or on the older ones, Rocket Alpha, only had 1 green light anyway. So trying to explain that to a military base, no, so I just said the gear's down. It was easier than explaining all that was going on. The actual locking mechanism is relatively complicated. The important bit is that little spade there, which clicks into a slot, and that's your gear in positive lock, it's called. That's not going anywhere. There are no weight on wheel switches. If I select the gear up on the ground, the gear's going up. Pure and simple. And that's a good thing if I'm running off the end of the runway. Because when the gear is retracted, half of the wheels are still sticking out the bottom of the nacelle. I can run along, I could even apply the brakes if I wanted, with the gear retracted. So minimal damage if I keep the aeroplane the right way up. If the gear's down and I hit an obstacle of some sort, chances are it's going to turn over, and that's going to do a lot of damage. So the standard brief was, in the event of running off the end of the runway, I will call gear up. You retract the gear. And the aircraft would settle onto its fuselage without further ado. It always puzzled me looking at the DAC. You think, how does that gear get up into that thing? Well, it's like a knuckle that does that. Yeah? That puzzled me for a while until I'd actually seen one on retraction tests, which made a lot of sense. The gear is held up just by hydraulic pressure. So if I lose all of my hydraulic pressure, the gear is going to come down, and it will lock just geometrically. Pure and simple. I've also got a hand pump, so I could actually select it. And what you... Let's go back to it. That top picture there. The gear selector handle is simply channeling the hydraulic fluid either into the up line or into the down line. Once I've got the gear up, if I put the handle to neutral, it traps the pressure in the system. That's how it was built, and that's the theory. The reality is, 70-year-old aeroplane, trapping hydraulic fluid is not going to trap very long. So the pressure is going to leak. Not the fluid, but the pressure itself will leak. So, all the time at Air Atlantique, once the gear is selected up, we leave the selector up. And now it's applying pressure all the time. The danger of that is that you get a leak in the upline on the gear. Well, we'll deal with that if we get it. Because the beauty of the system is I can isolate every single service on that aeroplane by selecting neutral or off to that particular system. I can top up the hydraulic fluid in flight if I need to. Tell me a modern aeroplane that will let you do that. slightly peculiar thing about the deck. It looks fairly straightforward. You've got air going into it just for ram air. That's the exhaust. So just like your Cherokee, you've got an exhaust, you've got a jacket around the exhaust pipe that we're going to use for heating. It's one of the most important controls if you're ditching, because there are a couple of ways that water can get into the cabin of an aeroplane that's ditching. One is through the cold air, just going straight into the mixing unit and then into the cabin. So what we do is tell the system, I want heat, I want to run hot. So I'll have this hot air, thank you very much. I don't want any cold air. So it shuts off the air supply from the cold air, so it's not going to get in that way, but it could get in from the hot air. So what they do is fit a spill valve, can't see it, but in the wheel bay, round about there, is a valve that we have control of in the aeroplane. And if I set that to spill, that air is going to go straight out the top of the engine. Not going to make it into the cabin. Dakota will float for about 2 weeks. If you ditch it correctly, and the main reason is you have to set the heating controls correctly. During the war they used to sink them deliberately because they were a hazard to shipping, just bimbling around the place. And there's the spill valves and then the mixer control. We heavily modified the heating system on ours so that all the heating came into the cockpit, because we weren't flying passengers for very often and we never took them for very far. So we needed the heat more than they did when we were doing freight trips. A typical freight trip into Europe, you'd be looking at 3 or 4 hours into near Europe. We could fly for 8 hours with 2.5 tons of freight, or 4 hours with 3.5 tons of freight, just to put it in context. If it's overheating, which is a possibility, you can get a duct overheat. Typically in summer, typically just after takeoff, the aeroplane will moan at you and say, it's too hot. So you just fly 10 knots faster and then it goes cold again. It's not remotely bothering. So I thought it would be fun just to fly a circuit. How are we doing for time? Yeah. So a typical circuit, 2 pilots. The aeroplane was designed single pilot, I should add that. And a lot of operators in the States still fly with single pilot. They always fly with somebody in the right-hand seat, so it's a little bit of a misnomer. And it's like all these things. Single pilot's fine until something goes wrong, and then you can't reach half the controls from the left-hand seat. So you'd quite like someone to move stuff for you, because getting the gear up just after takeoff involves you going down to the floor, thumb the latch away, pull that one up to 90 degrees, find that one, pull it out, pull it up, and now the gear's moving. And all the while you've just had your engine failure and you're trying to keep straight after takeoff. So it's much easier to call it and have someone else disappear into the floor and do all that stuff. It's very noisy on takeoff, so a lot of the communication is by hand gestures. Pilot flying starts the takeoff roll, taxi onto the end of the runway. The tail wheel can lock straight. We leave it loose while we're taxiing so we can turn corners nice and easily, but as soon as we're nice and straight on takeoff, we drop the lock on the tail wheel. So it will help us keep straight. So we set off with the stick slightly aft, put a bit of pressure onto that tail wheel so that it's going to help you keep straight. If you've got a crosswind, typical controls, light aircraft, you might have full aileron at that. On the deck, full aileron is that. And it's still not enough. Okay? So you'll often set off like that. You've got one hand on the power levers, and we have the friction really quite tight. And we walk them up forward. And pilot flying just looks straight outside and keeps straight. And if you don't give it an inch, it will behave. If you let it wander off a couple of feet this way, it's suddenly 4 feet that way, and then 8 feet that way, and life gets too exciting. Don't give it an inch, show it who's boss, and she'll behave. Pilot monitoring is watching the power come up. And they'll call the manifold pressures, so pilot flying doesn't have to look at the gauges. And what we're listening for is the cadence as much as the numbers. We're listening for 15, 20, 25, 30, about that pace. If I hear 15, 20, 25, somebody's moving the throttles too fast. 15, 20, 20, 20, time to take over. At 40 inches of manifold, there's a little tap on the back of your hand and that means let go. Pilot flying now lets go the power levers onto the wheel and push. And at that point, they'll now switch to calling airspeeds, 60, 70, 80, 82 rotate. Gentle ease back, off we go. Not the mega climb rate that we're used to in modern ones. No, 4 degrees nose up. Yeah, the Earth leaves us rather than us necessarily leaving it. And then it's that means gear up. Down into the floor, move all the levers. Give me power 1. Power 1 is the first power reduction. I can have power 1 for an hour. I can have full power depending on what you read and where. We always thought we had 5 minutes for about 10 years, and then someone read a different book and said, actually it's a minute. Okay. So you make that call, and you're aiming for 100 knots at 100 feet. Power 1. The power reduction is done by pilot monitoring, and they'll move the props and the throttles together, because we want to try and keep that ratio of manifold pressure and RPM the same. So it's a nice gentle change as we come back to 42.5 inches excuse me, and 2550 RPM. 200 feet, 120 knots, power 2. 35 inches, 2350 RPM, I can have that for an hour. Sorry, I can have that all day now. That's climb power. At that point, pilot flying gets the throttles back and calls for the after takeoff checks. So here we are, climbing away nicely. We've done the 100 knots power 1, 110, 20, 110 power 2. Good lookout, and we used to fly an oval circuit, so straight around the corner. And we'd throttle back to about 25 inches, 2050 RPM for the downwind leg, that'll give you 120 knots. We'll beam the touchdown point, we'd call gear down, flap 1, and the landing checks. And the flap settings, we're a bear and tiny brain, we have flaps 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is full flap, you've got a quarter flap, half flap, 3 quarters. And the flaps are barn doors. They go from aileron to aileron, right across the belly of the aeroplane, including underneath the fuselage. So they're a very, very effective flap. Hold your height, wait for 95 knots, trim it, and we'll come back to 18 inches of manifold at that. And if we get it right, we won't have to touch the power again. So that would be a typical takeoff. Note the attitude that you're getting the aircraft up to. Get their tail up, nice level attitude, because that's the one you're going to hold off to again on landing. Alpha Fox was heavily modified at this time with that radome, testing the radar. In fact, it was the Nimrod 2000 radar, I think, that one. Jet engine deck. That was to cope with the electric, the radar. So we had an extra little power unit on the back, and then that messed up with the stability, so we had lumps of plywood stuck to the tail to help with directional stability a bit better. Climbing turn downwind, look at the gear. Remember I said when the gear's up, it's actually sticking out still. Yeah? That's why you can belly up one of these without doing a great deal of damage. Those are the gear controls, so that's the little latch. It's got an extra latch over the end of it there. The very long lever is the emergency hand pump for the hydraulics. That's the gear selector. That's the micro switch that gives you the lights. That's the flap selector. And then we've got the various controls for autopilots and such. Even the autopilot was hydraulic back in the day. That didn't work. That shows you the flaps a little better. You see what I mean? They continue right across the belly of the aeroplane. And that's full flap, which is 40 odd degrees. I think. A short field landing in a deck, you'd be looking at a threshold speed of around 65 knots, which is pretty slow, and you have no aileron control whatsoever. So we'd only do that when we had to. The attitude that we hold off to for a wheeler landing, which is what we always chose to do, is exactly the same attitude that you saw on the takeoff run. So we're landing just on the main wheels, holding it level, still hold it off, but in a level attitude, not a three-point attitude. And the reason we don't use the three-point was, if you saw the shape of the wingtip stall on a DAC is a thing of beauty. It's quite spectacular, and you really don't want to see it near the ground. So let's keep it nice and calm and do a wheeler landing. And then get busy. A number of times I see people and they've done a really nice landing, squeak, you know, she's down, they've checked forward, they've kept the tail up, all is well with their world. And then you run out of airspeed and the tail comes down and they think, phew, they know what you're thinking every step of the way, so don't give up until you're parked. I said that, I always get it wrong, I think 7 aeroplanes were converted to sprayers. We put a little air-driven pump under the belly. You can see the spray booms there, and then the tanks filled the entire aeroplane with dispersant. We used to train using water. This is mid-bay, just off Inverness. Water weighs exactly the same as dispersant. When we were spraying, there was no pitch change as we lost fluid. The whole thing was so nicely balanced that it just didn't do a thing. And we sprayed at the rate of about a ton a minute. So it's not dumping the stuff, we were trying to put it down in a measured way, accurately in a particular place. I did once nearly have to report a dolphin strike. Big bays full of dolphins, and the blessed thing jumped out of the water in front of me, frightened the pair of us probably, but it certainly made me jump. And then I mused how I would fill that in on the form for the CAA, you know. Happy to fish. Now, see if this works. The biggest oil spill that we had attended was the Brer up in Shetland. See if I can get it to play. Come on, you know you want to. The Brer was spectacular in many ways. I mean, a disaster for the local ecology, but the weather was atrocious. Every day, at some point during the day, for a fortnight, the wind reached over 100 knots. And we were supposed to be spraying in that. Well, needless to say, we didn't. Doesn't grow, has it? Wake up. It is wrong.
Assist Club News from the BBC with Anna Ford and Andrew Harley.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. There's a slick 7 miles long off the Shetland Islands tonight as oil continues to spill from the wrecked tanker which ran aground yesterday. The government launches an inquiry to find out what went wrong. Many seabirds have already died. Seals and otters are also threatened. Aircraft have been battling to contain the pollution. The tanker which ran aground on Shetland yesterday. The Braer was carrying 85,000 tonnes of oil. It's thought half of that has gone into the sea. During the day, 6 aircraft have been spraying chemicals onto the oil to try to disperse it. The government has begun an inquiry into what caused the accident. The American owner of the Braer has defended the actions of his crew in using the Shetland route, but says his company is going to carry out an investigation. The tanker is on the rocks in Kendale Bay on the southern tip of Shetland. The winds and tides have pushed the oil around Fitful Head on the southwest coast to make the slick about 7 miles long and it's 4 miles wide. Small pools of oil have been sighted further along the coast as far as St Ninian's Isle. Just north of here, at Clift Sound, is Shetland's greatest concentration of salmon farms. There are about 9 or 10 in the area. There's another slick at Sombra Head, but so far it hasn't moved up the east coast.
This evening, the Braer was still stuck fast on the rock she struck yesterday. Although she's been hauled, the authorities say that her hull remains largely intact and there's no indication that she's about to break up. Planes from the Marine Pollution Control Unit have spent the day spraying chemicals onto the slick, the pilots often flying only yards above the sea. Weather conditions have for the moment eased, but winds are still too strong for any attempt to reach the Braer to pump off the thousands of tons of oil remaining in her hold.
time. So, other decks that are kicking around the UK currently, that's C41 Alpha, to be pedantic. It's the only C41 Alpha. It's a military DC3, so it has the passenger door and a very plush interior. It was General Hap Arnold's aeroplane, for the history buffs among you, from the US Air Force, among other things. The aeroplane in the background belongs to the Spielbergs, Mr. or Mrs. They've got one each. That was in its base in California before it came over for the D-Day anniversary a few years ago. We've got Dragamount in the distance, and Alpha Fox, the one with the radome, is now in military colours and flying with Air Atlantique out of North Wheeling, typically. Sierra Victor, somebody had a picture of Sierra Victor. She's with the Indian Air Force, historic flight. They were gifted the aeroplane by a gentleman in the UK for their historic flight, and a couple of our guys delivered it for them. About a month later, I got a phone call going, could somebody come and teach us how to fly it? So I had a lovely time teaching them. More famous in the UK for the poppy drops, air shows, things like that. And if you were at Duxford a few years ago, it was probably the largest gatherings of DACs we're ever likely to see. The good news is that they're doing it again this year. I don't think it's going to be Duxford, I think it's going to be North Wheeling. And there's only going to be sort of 5 or 6 coming over from the States to join in, but it's going to be cool. And I think I've probably waffled on long enough. Has anybody got any questions?
Have you ever had anything to do with Buffalo over in Yellowknife?
No, not in terms of the DACs. I gave them a load of training material for the Electra. When they took the Electra out there, so Joe came and offered me a job. Yeah.
I was fascinated by your story of the first flight of the DC2.5. Were they not tempted to fit both the 2 wings?
I think it was a question of time. I think if someone was shooting at you, you'd do what you had to do and get away. But I can't remember the exact details. I just remember the story. But I mean, the wings are interchangeable. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands decided a few years ago that he wanted to fly his aeroplane again, and his aeroplane was hanging in the museum in Holland, and the wings were absolutely rotten. There was no way was that ever going to fly. So we took his fuselage, gave him 2 wings, took another 2 on the one in the museum, and job's a good one. Off they went. Yeah.
Can you relate one of your emergencies with the aircraft?
Have I had any?
Yes.
Yes. A few. The old engine. Yeah. Mostly engine related.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to happen at some point. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I remember as a young lad, my first flight about the DAC across the channel, and my abiding memory was climbing on board, having to climb over what I thought was a made spar to get to the front seats, but obviously isn't from what you said.
No, there's no obstacle on the... what you'll remember is it was a really steep hill.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, so you're going up the hill, but no, there's no spar to go in.
I seem to remember climbing over.
Intra maybe put something there, but
Oh, maybe.
it wasn't a spar. Yeah, I used to bum a ride on that one. Funnily enough, it was Papa Yankee. Which took back to the States last year. So my first and last. Yes, sir.
Interesting with the disbursement agent, how long would your refill and turnaround be?
We could refill one in about 10 minutes with a big pump. We had a big pump, and we always carried a little pump with us, so we were totally self-sufficient, and the little pump would take half an hour or so. But as soon as the rest of the ground crew turned up, they brought the big pump, and the job's done. So,
Doing one of the ones a bunch of years ago, did they keep it having to like rebuild the engines?
I'm sorry, I've gone back to the show.
flew on one of the ones at Coventry quite a few years ago. Did you have to keep them like really boring engines? Did you were saying that when it was on the ground, you have to like really be careful about the engine?
You do, yeah. Cylinder head cooling is always it's an issue because they're actually very forgiving compared to water-cooled engines. Things like the Merlin have far bigger problems. The DAC would sit on the ground at a low power perfectly happily as long as the cowl flaps were open. So if the grills are open, if our boss saw you with the grills shut, you could hear him yelling from inside the cockpit. You basically keep rebuilding. You give them one and take one back. We did try and do our own overhauls for a while. We had an arrangement with a company in Malta, Myarco, who overhauled DAC engines, but we had serious problems with quality control on them. I had a failure on one when they pulled it apart. They found a belt buckle in the crank. Things like that. So it doesn't give you a lot of faith. So we used to look and see what colour engine it was as to who built it. I'm sorry. Yeah, if you got it if you got it through 5 hours, it was probably going to be good for life. Yeah, but those first few hours were always you wouldn't want 2 green nacelles, let's put it that way. You'd want one grey one green one, because the grey ones were built in America and were very good.
There was a company in Oshkosh re-engineering DC3s. Have you flown that?
I've flown in one, but I haven't flown it. It's a Basler DAC.
That's the one, yeah.
And they put a PT6 on it. And you're putting an indestructible engine onto an indestructible aeroplane. It's a fabulous mixture. It's a really competent aeroplane. A lot of them in Antarctica, because they're very popular down there because of their capability.
Have they done many of those?
They've done a lot. And they've got I was at the factory about 18 months ago, and they've literally got a field full of old fuselages. I was heartbroken in many ways, because you can see all the old paint schemes, and you know where they've been and what they've been doing. Some still had their military colours. And the chap showing us around was very proud of the fact that there wouldn't be a single original piece left on it by the time they'd finished. But they're not allowed to say they're building them. If they said they were building a DAC, it's a whole new licensing system with the FAA. But it's triggers broom. They can replace bits, and they don't get any grief. Ask Boeing.
That was a great talk, thank you. Quite proud to say, the only plane I've ever flown in my life was a DC3.
Oh, fantastic.
Air Atlantique, Bournemouth Airport.
Oh, yeah.
Pleasure flight. Good few years ago, but it was fantastic, it was brilliant.
We had a whale of a time doing those pleasure flights. We toured the country at different times. And my favourite was the tall ships race.
Oh, yeah.
We'd fight over that one. Everybody had a week in a different port, and we'd do the pleasure flights around the tall ships. Take it to the next port, wait for the ships to catch up, and we'd swap crews. So I had a fabulous week in Cork. Thank you, tall ships. Forrest. Yeah.
Hi, you mentioned that the German LBA killed off passenger flying in Berlin. Was it the CAA that did similar for the UK?
Not at all. In fairness to the CAA, I'm not their biggest fan always, but to give them credit where it's due, they're on record as saying they will not be the people that ground a DC3. So they said all along that under national exemptions, a DAC would be allowed to pleasure fly. And I think in North Wales they may well end up doing it again.
Right. And that's how the Dutch managed to do it today, I guess.
The Dutch are doing it by a somewhat circuitous method, shall I say. It's a club. They all own part of the aeroplane.
Okay, thanks.
I was lucky, along with about 20 of our Coventry model flying members, to be invited by Charlie to Badminton to watch this was part way through COVID, but we got to go and have a look at night flights being assembled. And at that stage, the wings were off, the engines were just come back from being completely refitted. And interesting to hear you say about the 2.5 mark, because their wings were slung up on the walls in the hangar, up on edge, waiting to go in and be aligned, and then the big bolster pins sent through to the hinge pins that went in. But when we were talking to him, because our lot, and again, they've got the floors up in between the cargo bay and the cabin.
Yeah.
They got a lot of the floor panels up there, and you could step across, which was lovely to see your cockpit photographs. But they were on about that at some point in time, they're going to look to go about some spurious route to gain pleasure flight in an unusual manner.
I think most people, running one of these aeroplanes is a phenomenal expense, and they've got to be able to pay for themselves somehow. So finding a method, there aren't enough air shows in the country to make it worthwhile, and you've always got the RAF will do it for free. So you're never going to compete with that commercially. Air Legends down at North Wales do paradropping, and they do quite a lot of parachuting out of it. But they have plans for doing other things. Good.
Kath,
Yep.
could you tell us about that other aeroplane that you're involved in, the Lancaster?
Yes, I'm one of the volunteers on Just James, so a couple of times a month I'll go up to East Kirkby and taxi people around, which is just amazing. Still pinching myself. Yes, sir.
How tolerant was it to icing? Did you operate?
Not very. It's a really thick wing, so you would definitely lose quite a bit of airspeed picking up ice. We did our best to avoid it. We got very good at avoiding ice. The general rule was climb. Just keep going up until the droplets are too small to cause you any grief.
Did you operate it? Can you operate it quite icing?
Sorry.
Paul Bryan, I was an ex-SATCO at Coventry Airport, and I'm here tonight with a Deputy SATCO, Nigel, and I'd like to pay you a compliment to start with, Kath, because in all the time that I worked for you on an aircraft flying at Coventry, I always found that you were most adaptive and cooperative in any tricky traffic situation, and I'm quite surprised really at the age of the aircraft, and sadly we were delayed tonight, not by air traffic, but traffic on the motorway, so I don't miss this. I'm interested to know how many hours you've actually done on the DAC, and secondly, how adaptive did you find the aircraft to fit in with all the various other aircraft types that we had operating at Coventry at that time, bearing in mind it varied from Cherokees, Senecas, which I think you've got a lot of hours on, and jets as well.
Thank you very much, is the first thing. I know the voice now. Not often I can put the face to it, I know the voice.
You're clear to land.
Sort of thing. I've got about 2,500 hours on DACs. The aircraft is really very adaptable. Because we're flying relatively slowly, we can go quicker, but we generally aim for 120 knots in the circuit, and on the approach we're doing 95. So we're only 5 knots different to a Seneca sort of thing. 150s, we'll be curling our toes around the brakes at some point and trying to slow down. Because what we can't do is just throttle back. We've got to keep power on. So hence we just throw it away. We'll just go around and find ourselves a gap and come back.
Yeah.
Has been a far easier solution than staying behind a 150.
Yeah.
Maybe one more question. Okay, last question.
When you were spraying dispersant on these oil slicks, how do you know where the oil slicks are? Like, does somebody plot them for you?
Yeah.
And can you see them visually, or do you go by dead reckoning?
When we're at spray height in the DAC for real is 20 feet. And you can smell it, you can taste it, but you can't see it. More importantly, what you see everywhere is oil. But some of it's a real thin sheen that we're not bothered about. It's the real heavy accumulations that we're targeting. And what we have is another aeroplane sitting over the top, steering us left a bit, right a bit, spray on, spray off, and we flew a 300-foot circuit and got around it that way, because you can't see now.
Kath, on behalf of the branch, I would like to thank you for a truly cracking start to this calendar year and our January lecture. It's been a fantastic lecture. I've made a few notes as we go along, and I guess what I'd like to say thank you for is, it's clear in aircraft a lot of us have got a little bit of knowledge about, I'd say a little bit of knowledge. What you've been able to do tonight is add your certain charm and some great stories and background about the technology and some of your experiences yourself. So whether it was little points about the intricacies of the hydraulic system, choosing between the carriage and the wipers perhaps. I had no idea how hydraulic wipers on the Dakota. I had no idea about that at all. And the nuances of the fuel transfer system, just how rugged the engine was, even down to managing when you've got an issue with the cylinder head and run the engine wall before you come in. And what was quite nice then is you talked us through a circuit and how the aircraft handled that, and being able then to bring that to life by showing us some video footage of the oil spill the team managed was truly a really compelling talk tonight. So, Kath, on behalf of us, I'd like to say thank you very much. I guess we've got some parish notices.
Of course we've got parish notices, Mr. Chairman. Nice to be back.
Good to have you back, Chris.
Right. I'll run first through the rest of the lecture programme until... I'll start anyway.
It probably won't work. The museum laptop.
That's my insurance policy, Dave. Right, parish notices. Let's do the forthcoming lectures first. This is not one of ours, but it comes highly recommended. The Newcomen Midlands Public Lecture at the Birmingham Science Museum, which is the think tank or Millennium Point, the new science and technology organisation. It's about the RAF aircraft that won the Battle of Britain being made on German machinery in Birmingham by a lecturer called Jonathan Aylin, who has researched the background of Spitfires, Hurricanes and others being built on pieces of equipment coming from Western Germany. That is Wednesday the 7th of February at 7 o'clock. It is free, doors open at 6:30.
It was working.
Oh, don't worry about it, mate. Next one of ours, on the 15th of February, the following week, multiple unmanned aircraft. It's on. Hey, well done. Dr. Joseph Barnard has done a lot of research into the way insects and other small animals benefit from working in swarms and how to translate that learning into unmanned air vehicles. So swarms of helicopters, swarms of drones being more effective than working individually. Should be fascinating. Pleased to say that we now have full confirmation of the J.D. North Memorial Lecture, which is to be held in March. As I hope you're all aware, the J.D. North is held at Moog, which is the successor company after Doughty Bolt and Paul. It's on Thursday the 21st of March, starting at 6 p.m, and it's being given by Tim Williams, who is the chief engineer of Air Alice. Air Alice is a relatively new company, started with a display in Farnborough about 2018, I think, there or thereabouts. And what they are trying to do is, having recognised the problems of training aircraft being specific to the role that they are adopting, so in other words you get a jet fighter trainer and a transport trainer, they are trying to put all of those characteristics into one airframe and change the way in which it behaves. The project, as I say, is only about 6, maybe 7 years old, and he's coming to talk about the technical challenges of the innovative approach that Air Alice are taking into developing a modular flying training aircraft. Now, the one thing you need to understand about JD North is that to get into the Moog site, you have to be pre-registered. If you don't give them car registration, name, date of birth, I can't remember what the rest of the details are, but I will have them for you soon, you will not get through the door. It's all to do with the military and commercial security, nothing to do with lecture, but that is essential. So next month I will have all the necessary details for you. Sorry, John.
Chris,
yes?
Pre-registration forms are on the table.
Oh, we've already got them.
Right.
There you go. I am preempted by better people as usual. Thanks, John. So anybody wants to go to Moog on the 21st of March, John's got them on the table outside. Excellent. Right. Thursday the 18th of April, we have Roger Beasley coming back, who used to be the commanding officer of experimental flying at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and he's talking about flying around the world in a somewhat dated Comet Mark IV. It'll be full of anecdote, full of humour, as always. Excellent recommended lecture. Thursday the 16th of May is a technical one. We start with the AGM at 6:15, and this is from Professor Antonio Filipponi, who is Professor of Computational Aerodynamics at the School of Engineering, University of Manchester, my alma mater. And he's talking about the historical development of coaxial contra-rotating propellers. Yeah, I don't know an awful lot on that, I'm afraid. Say again?
There'll be an exam after.
There will be an exam afterwards. And finally, the 20th of June, to finish off the season, the story of Gloucesters, how they started from making wooden cabinets and wardrobes up to making javelins, by Laurie Hilditch, who was an ex-RAF fast jet and test pilot. The complete story of the history of Gloucestershire's aircraft company. Right, what else do I need to tell you? Visits. That's the one. Ken, where are you, mate? Thank you. Okay, just making sure. Ken has, in his normal professional approach, organised us a visit on the 28th of March, which is also a Thursday, to 2 sites in South Wales. The first is the British Airways maintenance at Cardiff, where you get a tour around their repair hangars, maintenance hangars, and so on in the morning. And then the South Wales Aviation Museum in the afternoon. They are both on or very close to Cardiff Airport in the Vale of Morgan.
Yeah, the South Wales Aviation Museum is in fact at the old Snafton.
Oh, it's at Snafton, is it? Okay, sorry.
Base. It's all right.
Yeah, close, but no.
It's close. It's all right.
Right. Transport is organised by coach from Stourbridge as normal.
Yeah.
Expected cost for the entire day came out at
£47.50.
£47.50, but buy your own lunch.
That's right.
Yeah, lunch provided, decent menu, but that has to be paid for locally.
Yeah.
All inquiries to Ken.
Yeah.
Nice early morning start as well, ladies and gents.
Yeah.
You'll enjoy it. Anything else that anybody can think of that needs announcing? I've done JD, that's the one that matters most. you've got the rest of it. Oh yes, the last one. I mentioned sometime last year that, without being in any way disrespectful, a group of retired old farts is not the future for the branch at Birmingham, Wolverhampton and Cosford, and I count myself in that group now as well, so I'm not being unkind. We talked about wanting to make a growth and development policy for Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Cosford branch in the way of getting into apprentice training, continuous professional development for young engineers coming up through the grades. It's the cornerstone of all of the STEM work that we do with local school kids, building aeroplanes, putting on exciting days at the museum. And it's an appeal to all of you, please, for ideas about what we as a branch can do to extend our activities, to extend our coverage, the number of people that we actually contact and influence and guide towards what I've believed has been a fascinating career for 50 years, and I'm sure you probably agree with that. But without that activity, our time is limited. It really is as serious as that. So anybody, any ideas about how we can advertise what we do, expand what we do, contact new groups that don't even know we exist, please come forward with them. We will take them all very seriously and hopefully develop a growing branch. Our target when we announced it at the beginning of this year was to have the complete plan of our activities to be presented to you at the September lecture next year, which will be this branch's 80th anniversary of its foundation. So, there's the challenge. Anything you can think of, get in touch. Questions? Anything? Can I sit down? That's it. Thank you, Darren.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you and good night. Yes, quite. Yes? Yeah. Well, I know Mike Rockfield because he was one of our lecturers, wasn't he?